everyone and welcome back to my channel. I got a few questions after I posted my Times Square video on how I made the entire 18th century Robella Frances outfit. So I guess it's finally a good time for me to dig out all those footages I shot half a year ago but never really had a chance to edit. I know that people are probably most curious about the dress itself, but I want to start with how I made the stays first because I think foundation garments are really important in creating the period silhouette, and in my humble opinion, they definitely deserve more love and attention. The stays I made is based on this pair of 1740 stays from the Museum of the City of New York, whose pattern can be found in the incredible as always Patterns of Fashion 5. I chose to make this one specifically because it has both front and back lacing, the most suitable for peasants like me who don't have a maid to dress them every day. Sadly though, the measurement of these stays is very different from my own, so I had to make quite a few adjustments to the original pattern and make 2 mock-ups before landing on the correct silhouette. I used 4 layers of fabric for the stays: carnation pink cotton sateen for the top layer, white linen for lining, and cotton canvas for the 2 layers sandwiched in between. The very first step is to trace and cut out all 3 layers except for the lining. Stack them on top of one another and baste 3 layers together. All the basting stitches are going to be taken out eventually, so I just went with the ugliest and worst quality threads I had. Next, I used an erasable aka heat-sensitive pen to mark out all the boning channels. Each channel is a 1/4 inch or 6.3 millimeters wide. I was fully planning on constructing this the historically accurate way and backstitching all the boning channels by hand. But considering that this is my first ever attempt at stay making and there's a 95% chance that I might accidentally make a mistake or grow to hate it in 2 years, I decided to go with the much faster machine stitching. As you can see, even without any boning, the piece already is quite sturdy. The German plastic boning I ordered a month ago still had not arrived yet, so I had to go with my backup plan, which was flat reed. Reed boning was actually used in the 18th century as a cheaper alternative to baleen. For instance, this pair of stays from 1780 is completely boned with reed. However, reed can snap very easily, so I soaked the entire coil in water and waited until they were half dry before inserting them into the boning channels. Here comes the most exciting but also physically and emotionally painful and exhausting part of the whole process: inserting the bones. First, I cut the reed into a proper length, smoothing out the tips with sandpaper so that the boning won't cut through the fabric. I used a chopstick to open up the channels a bit more and then stick the boning in very slowly. Even though the reed was a lot more flexible than before, they still tend to break halfway through at places where the channels were a bit too tight. After consulting my dad on the phone for over an hour, we finally figured out the solution. I used 2 strands of nylon thread, stitched one end securely to the reed, and attached the other end to a straighted paper clip, or anything you have that's thin enough to go through the boning channel. I pushed the paper clip through the channel and then gently pulled the boning inside. The whole boning process was a lot more frustrating and time-consuming than I thought, especially when I didn't have access to the proper tools thanks to COVID. But once I got into the rhythm, things just went a lot faster. One single piece of reed might look more than a bit flimsy, but once they are all lined up together like so, they turn out to offer quite a lot of stiffness. In the end, it took me 2 days to insert all the 108 bonings. I then started to deal with the seam allowance on the sides. I trimmed away some fabric on the canvas so that when folded in, the seam allowance wouldn't look too bulky. Slip stitch the seam allowance in place with single strand of sturdy linen thread. all the fabrics and boning I ordered ages ago finally arrived. Oh well, I guess I'm just gonna have to save them for some future projects. Next, I marked where I wanted the eyelets to go on the center front and center back pieces. Stays usually have spiral lace instead of cross lacing we see on 19th and 20th century corsets. That's why the eyelets on one side are always a bit offset from the eyelets on the other side. Use an awl to open up a hole on the mark point and secure the eyelets by hand. Metallic eyelets weren't invented until the 1820s, so all eyelets were done by hand in the 18th century. The eyelet hole would shrink back a bit while stitching, so I had to go back in with the awl from time to time to keep it fully open. Here's what it looks like once all 48 eyelets were finished. Finally, I started assembling all pieces together, going through the edges like so to securely stitch adjacent pieces together using double linen thread. In most of the modern simplified versions of stays, the separate pieces are stitched together first before bonings are inserted. However, from my research I learned that stay makers in the 18th century usually did it the other way around, mainly for two reasons. One is that it is so much easier to insert the bonings into individual pieces, and the other reason is that back in the days, they would loosely attach the pieces together, have a fitting with the customers, make alterations, and then reassemble them together. I was pretty sure that I didn't need to make more adjustments, but I still did a quick fitting just to make sure the stays landed in the right position and the shoulder strap had the right lengths. After the fitting, I trimmed away the seam allowance on the top and bottom of the stays. I then cut out the shoulder strap from one layer of cotton sateen and slip stitched it to the stays. For decoration purpose, I stitched down this 1/4 inch wide ribbon to cover up all the seams using a running stitch. Remember not to pull the thread too tightly, otherwise the ribbon would just sink into the seam instead of lying flat on top of it. Fold the ends onto the back side and stitch them down. I chose to bind the top and bottom edges with this 1/2 inch wide white twill tape. My naivete told me that binding would be the easiest part of the whole process, but then I realized that nothing is easy when it comes to stay making. Because the boning gets in the way of everything, it was actually pretty hard to push the needle through and stick it out from the right spot. It also didn't help that I chose a really narrow twill tape. According to Patterns of Fashion 5, the binding on the outside of the original stays is about 5 mm wide. The one I have is only 3 mm wide. I started with the front side and then finished the binding on the back. Because the shoulder strap is only one layer of fabric, I was able to stitch the two sides of the twill tape together instead of stitching the front first and then the back. At this point, the stays are almost done. You can just see from the back how much work goes into making one pair of stays. But soon you will never be able to see this again because the next and last step is the lining. I traced out the shape of the individual tabs using leftover linen fabrics from making my 18th century shift. Iron in the seam allowance and slip stitch it onto the tabs. I then made a lining for the shoulder straps using the same method. For the rest of the stays, I simply took a large piece of fabric, traced out the general contour, and stitched it down in place. Finally, I made the eyelets on the shoulder straps and the stays are officially completed. Not including patterning and mock-up, the whole thing took me about 100 hours. I was really surprised by the sheer amount of hardcore manual labor involved in making stays. Perhaps that's why back in the 18th century, dresses were always made by women, but stays were made by men. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and please subscribe if you want to see more of my sewing projects.